And I want to talk a little bit about two things this morning. One, the Book of the 12 and the editing of the prophetic corpus in general. And then to conclude, the one oddball prophet in the mix, who is Jonah. and who really, isn't a prophet at all in the usual sense of the word. But first of all, with regard to the editing. Now, we have been looking at the prophets, trying to imagine them in the context in which they lived. And no doubt this is how those oracles began. But then, sometimes these must have circulated for maybe a couple of hundred years before they got written down. When they were written down, they were usually edited into a particular framework. And I usually refer to that framework as Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic. Now, a purist might quibble about that as to how exactly Deuteronomistic they are. But the basic idea behind the editing of the prophetic books is that the Torah is the big thing, and the prophets are sent by God to make people conform to the Torah. Now, I don't think that's what Amos thought he was doing. I don't think that's what Ezekiel thought he was doing, but it's what the editors want you to think that they were doing.
Most of them were written before, though, most of the Torah, right?
Most of them were. That's why I don't think Amos was preaching the Torah. It didn't exist at the time when he was, and the Torah. Well, Jeremiah was probably contemporary with Deuteronomy, but that was about it. Now, but there has been a shift, I would say. Back when I was a student, all the emphasis was on the original words of the prophets. And if you read Gerhard von Rad, was a great German biblical theologian, this is what he was doing. Now, after that, in the last, 20 or 30 years of the last century, there was a shift towards, a more literary approach, something that was emphasizing the books as we have them rather than the original prophets. You discussed in a section the canonical approach of Brevard Childs. Now, Childs himself would not have admitted this, but I think it is well established that his approach was influenced to some degree by a movement in literary criticism that we call the New Criticism, which became fashionable in the middle part of the 20th century. And then, those things usually hit biblical studies maybe 10 or 15 years later. So I think this was a factor with Childs. I think Childs' own motivation was really more theological. But at the same time, I think he was colored by the fact that the current trend was to read the books as we have them. Now, if you try to read the books as you have them, you're putting the emphasis on the editors rather than on the prophets. And broadly speaking, I think there's a sharp difference in perspective, especially with regard to tradition, with regard to the authorities, the temple, the king, anything you name. The original prophets, by and large, were disruptors. Now, as we saw, not all prophets were that way, but the ones whose oracles were preserved tended to be the disruptors. People like Amos. Now, Isaiah was maybe cozy enough for the king, but even he could be quite critical of it. The editors, much less so. The editors are much more affirming of the institutions. And what they're really trying to do, I think, is domesticate the prophets, institutionalize them, if you like, make them conform to a system. And I think that was also the effect of Childs' canonical approach. It's to bring the prophets under a kind of umbrella of orthodoxy, a kind of umbrella of something that is not to be criticized. And Childs was very much opposed to anything like a sociological reading of the prophets. Because if you do a sociological reading of the prophets, well, then you're trying to ask how did they function in their society. And when you do that, you see it's a very human enterprise. And it is not one seamless garment of revealed truth that you're getting in the Hebrew Bible. What you are getting are conflicting voices very often, and people who are trying to hammer out their differences in the tradition. Now, I think the institutions are important. Even though the prophets were very critical of kings and cult, most of the time at least, they didn't think you could get along without them. So it's often a dialectical relationship. If you only had the prophets, they might be hard enough to take. The prophets have their validity in dialogue as a counterpart to those institutions. We come back to that a little bit in a few minutes. With regard to the minor prophets are what's called the Book of the 12. And traditionally, these were counted as one book. In the last, 30 years maybe, an awful lot of ink was spilt trying to find unity in the Book of the 12. And personally, I think it was largely a waste of effort. There's a very good biblical scholar at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York named Ben Sommer, who gave a paper one time on why Jews do not read books. Now, what he meant was nobody in the Jewish tradition ever tried to read books whole. Nobody would have read the whole Book of the 12 and tried to figure out what's the unity in this. What you typically get, and this is also true, I think, of Christianity for the most part, you usually get snippets, often taken quite out of context, but not looking at the editorial shaping of the whole corpus, in other words. Now, there are many ways of reading a text, and you certainly can read it with an eye to the way it is shaped as a whole. But I think the amount of shaping that was done on this literature is modest. In the book of Isaiah, as we saw, there were probably at least 3, maybe 4 different compositions that span a few hundred years. Now, we also saw in chapter 65 that suddenly the wolf was lying down with the lamb again, which was a nice little inclusio with the first part of the book. But to say that there is an inclusio, that you have a reference towards the end of the book to something that was near the beginning of the book, doesn't mean that the whole book is edited into a nice coherent whole. You just get little gestures in that direction from time to time. What you do find, now I think the Book of the 12 are almost in chronological order, but with a few exceptions. Joel comes too early. Hosea goes before Amos. But nonetheless, all the ones at the end of the 12 prophets are late, post-exilic. The most significant development, to my mind, in the Book of the 12, and to some degree in the other prophetic books too, is that when these oracles were being collected in Judah after the exile, by and large, people had forgotten or lost view of the original setting. The original prophets spoke to very specific situations. This is also true in the New Testament. If Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he was actually writing to the Corinthians. He wasn't writing to us. And, when you gather the books and when you make them into a canon, which is something we'll talk about at the end of the course, you take them out of their original context and therefore make them much more general. Now, one of the ways in which that appears is that, and I think I mentioned this a couple of classes ago, is that you get more and more oracles that are looking for some kind of cosmic judgment, where it's not just the Babylonians they want to get anymore. It's like in the Apocalypse of Isaiah that we looked at last day. God will swallow death forever. He will slay the dragon that is in the sea. He will address everything that's wrong with everything. Now, that's a kind of move towards the cosmic side, highly generalizing, and that definitely is part of what happens in the editing of the prophetic corpus, that it becomes less an address to the immediate situation in which the prophet lived, more a kind of judgment on the world and on life as a whole. A nice example of this is in the book of Joel. Joel, don't really know when Joel was written. It could be quite late after the exile. But the book of Joel starts out with a plague of locusts. And that is what gives rise to his vision of the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord, this is in chapter 2. The day of the Lord is coming near. The day of the Lord we had in Amos. It also occurs in Isaiah. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like blackness spread on the mountain, a great and powerful army comes. But now he's starting out there speaking about a very specific crisis with the plague of locusts. Once you start calling it the day of the Lord, it takes on the connotations of a cosmic judgment. That this is almost the end of the world. But most strikingly, I think, in chapter 3 of Joel, then in those days and at that time. Now, that expression comes up several times in the prophetic text. There was one of them that we read in the book of Jeremiah. In those days and at that time. That is to say, in God's good time, sooner or later, it's affirming it, but it isn't necessarily expecting it to happen in your lifetime. Now, in those days and at that time, I will restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat literally means Yahweh judged. So it's the valley of judgment, you might say. And I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations. What are you to me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Are you paying me back for something? What's striking about that is it's not saying, and God will give us vengeance on Babylon, or on the Assyrians, or on anyone who did anything to us. It's all the nations. Equally in the book of Ezekiel, when you get Gog from the land of Magog. Now, the name may have come from Gyges of Lydia, who had absolutely nothing ever to do with Judah or Israel. But again, he becomes symbolic of all the nations. And all the nations are to be judged. If there's a positive side to this, it is that Yahweh will then be exalted and Jerusalem will be exalted at the end. It's a bit xenophobic. It is, but with vast resentment towards the nations. And it's not difficult to see why. It was natural enough, I think. But that's the way the prophetic corpus goes. At the end of the book of the 12, the book of Zechariah deteriorates. By which I mean the last 6 chapters are oracles that we just cannot figure out when these were written or why. And you see, these are oracles, to be true of some of the oracles against the nations and the other books too. Oracles that were passed on, but people just forgot over time what the context of them was. And it becomes very difficult to make much sense of them in this context. One remarkable passage is in Zechariah chapter 13. On that day, says the Lord of hosts, I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, so that they will be remembered no more, and I will remove from the land the prophets and the unclean spirit. And if any prophets appear again, their fathers and mothers who bore them will say to them, you shall not live, for you speak lies in the name of the Lord. Now, I should say, prophecy dies out as far as we can tell. Prophecy became prominent with the rise of the monarchy. The phenomenon was there beforehand, but it had a symbiotic relationship to the monarchy. While there were kings in Israel, they maintained prophets. You hear of these prophets who ate at Jezebel's table, this kind of thing. And also, the prophets had a focus of who they were to talk about. After the exile, you have, in the first generation, you have a few prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, the prophet whose oracles are preserved as Malachi, although Malachi just means my messenger. But after that, it dies out. You don't really meet a live prophet again till you get to John the Baptist. And when it appears in the first century of the Common Era, it is a somewhat different phenomenon. Now, this passage in Zechariah 13 is reflecting on the fact that prophecy was dying out and saying the day will come when a person will be ashamed to admit that he's a prophet. Why? Because everybody thinks you can't trust them. Now, you see, they had a few crises of prophecy. One big one was in the time of the Babylonians, when you had Jeremiah saying, God is on the side of the Babylonians, and other prophets saying, no, he isn't, God will defend us. And you had prophets fighting with each other. They're probably always the case. But by the time you get through the Babylonian exile, prophecy seems to have lost a lot of its credibility, at least as pronouncements on the immediate context. It's easy enough to preserve the words of the prophets and say these are telling us what will happen at the end of history hundreds of years after we're dead. That's fine. They don't bother you, but they're kind of shunted, and they become much less relevant to life. And if any prophets, says Zechariah 13, if any prophets appear again, their fathers and mothers who bore them will say to them, you shall not live, for you speak lies in the name of the Lord. And their fathers and mothers who bore them shall pierce them through when they prophesy. On that day the prophets will be ashamed, every one of their visions, when they prophesy. They will not put on a hairy mantle in order to deceive. Now, this is one of the latest passages in the prophetic corpus, and it implies, at least, that prophets were still wearing hairy mantles the way Elijah and Elisha are supposed to have done it. And each of them will say, I am no prophet, I am a tiller of the soil, which reminds you of Amos. But here, the idea is they won't want to associate, they wouldn't want to be thought of as prophets. And if anyone asks them, what are these wounds on your chest? The answer will be, the wounds I received in the house, you could translate it, the wounds I received in the house of my lovers, which is quite fascinating as to what was going on. And the tamer translation would be in the house of my friends. But in any case, it implies that prophets would have gashes. Why? Did we meet any story of prophets cutting themselves? Yes. The prophets of Baal in the story of Elijah cut themselves till their blood flowed out. And that seemed to be a way of whipping themselves up into ecstasy. Now, I would take it from that passage in Zechariah that prophets of Yahweh must have done that too. But by about 500, this whole enterprise had lost a lot of its credibility. And the oracles are taken more and more to be general kind of oracles about things that are to happen in the distant future. The very last book in the prophets is Malachi. And in Malachi chapter 3, it says, "See, I am sending my messenger," and that's Malachi, "to prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. But who can endure the day of his coming?" Handel again. "For he is like a refiner's fire, like a fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the descendants of Levi." So what it ends with here again in chapter 4, the day is coming burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubble. And at the very end of the book, and probably an editorial edition, "Remember the teaching of my servant Moses." Now, it's maybe a bit of a cliche that in Second Temple Judaism, you don't need prophets because you have the law. That the law displaces other forms of revelation. And that seemed to be the comment here at the end of the Book of the 12. "Remember the teaching of my servant Moses, and the statutes and ordinances that I commanded him at Horeb. And then, lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents." That one will be picked up in the New Testament when the disciples ask Jesus, "Isn't Elijah supposed to come first?" And the implication is that, well, John the Baptist actually was Elijah. But be that as it may, I think it's an example of this eschatological drift, you might say, of the way prophecy develops. Any comment on any of that? Yes, Andrew. Priests and scribes. Well, now, that's a very good question. The one piece of evidence that suggests that there were is in the book of Malachi. And we will probably on Monday look at one passage in that in relation to Ezra. But Malachi is bitterly critical of the priesthood. Now, we don't even know the man's real name. He's almost erased. But then after that, if there were prophets and their prophecies got suppressed, we wouldn't know. But we don't have anything. Again, after Malachi, I think Malachi was probably a contemporary of Ezra. That would be in the middle of the 5th century. And then you're going to go a couple of hundred years. When you get down to the Maccabean times in the 2nd century, prophecy gets transformed into apocalypticism. And one of the things, the apocalypses are always attributed to a famous ancient person, Enoch or Daniel, but not somebody whose name you actually know. I mean, not somebody who's walking around the street. So at that point, it's much less direct and also much more concerned with the end of everything, although that could also have a message for the people's own time. Let's have a look at the book of Jonah. Jonah is tucked away in the middle of the book of the 12, but I like to use it at the end because it seems to me to be meta-prophecy, to be almost a commentary on prophecy. There was a prophet named Jonah mentioned in 2 Kings 14, but that has nothing to do with the book of Jonah, except that maybe that's where the name came from. Now, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, "Go at once to Nineveh." What country was Nineveh in? Assyria, yeah. Go, so nice people, right? Especially from a Jewish perspective. "And cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up to me." So Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish. Where was Tarshish? Spain. In other words, Jonah took off in the opposite direction. Now, this is the beauty of the book. Jonah never does what he's supposed to do. So he took off for Tarshish, paid his fare, and went on board. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. Now, there is a kind of exuberance in this book. It's not that they all cried to Baal or something. The implication is each of them had a different God to cry to. So you get this great cacophony of prayer. And they threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold. And the captain came and said to him, "What are you doing? Sound asleep. Get up, call on your God. Perhaps God will spare us." And then the sailors cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And they said to him, "Why is this calamity coming upon us? Where do you come from?" And he said, "I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven." And then the men were even more afraid and said, "What is it that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you?" And he said, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and the sea will quiet down." And, all the pagans in the book of Jonah are quite decent people for the most part. So they're reluctant to throw him overboard, but eventually they give in. They feared the Lord even more. And they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from raging. Then the Lord provided a large fish to swallow Jonah. Traditionally, this is often thought to be a whale. I'm not sure there would have been a whale around in the Mediterranean, but a large fish. Now, there have been people who have a very literal approach to the Bible and think that it isn't enough for the fish to swallow Jonah, you have to swallow the story too. And I think, it's perverse. Short of telling you with the heading, "This is funny," I don't know what an author could do to communicate that. It's about as blatantly a farce as you could write. It's a parody. So then Jonah prayed to the Lord from the belly of the fish, and the prayer then is a fairly standard psalm that may have been added to the book later. There is a tendency in the later books to stick in prayers. In the books of Esther and Daniel, the Greek versions of those books have prayers that aren't in the Hebrew or Aramaic at all. But, the scribes thought it was good that people should pray. So then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out on the dry ground. Now, poor old Jonah isn't left with much dignity at this point. There is not much that would be less dignified, I imagine, than being vomited by a fish. But there he is. Then the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying, "Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you." So Jonah went out and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly large city, a 3 days' walk across. But in fact, it wasn't that big at all, actually. It was, about 3 miles across. So if it took you 3 days to walk 3 miles, there was something wrong. But, everything here is exaggerated, and quite deliberately, I think. So, then Jonah began to go into the city, and he cried out, 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. And when the news reached the king of Nineveh, he got down from the throne and he sat in ashes, and he made a proclamation: no human being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed, they shall not drink waters. Human beings and animals shall be covered in sackcloth and shall cry mightily to the Lord. The donkeys being especially good at that, loud. And they shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their heart. Who knows, God may relent. Can you give me another example where people respond that way to the preaching of a prophet? Not even close. To the point that Isaiah says it's the task of the prophet to make them their ears thick and their hearts hard and whatever. Nowhere else do you get mass conversion in response to the preaching of a prophet. And needless to say, you weren't very likely to get that in Nineveh. But when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity that he said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. So was Jonah pleased? Hell no. But this was very displeasing to Jonah, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is this not what I said while I was still in my own country? That's why I fled to Tarshish in the beginning, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing." And now, one of the virtues of at least some prophets, think of Elijah. His virtue was zeal. Now, zeal is, that's what Elijah says, that I alone am zealous for the Lord and so forth. The prototype of zeal, do you remember? Phinehas, the man who followed the Israelites and the Moabite woman into the tent and ran the two of them through on his spear. And the Lord gave him a covenant of peace and an eternal priesthood. There is a strand in the Bible, and a lot of the prophets lend themselves pretty well to it, that elevate zeal as the perfection of piety. Now, Jonah is depicted that way here. We'll talk about this in connection with the Psalms. One of them is, with a perfect hatred, I have hated them. And we will consider whether, in fact, there is a virtue of hatred, as some people have maintained. Now, this is what Jonah had. And from Jonah's point of view, the proper thing would be to obliterate the people of Nineveh. So he says, "Now, O Lord, please take my life from me. It is better for me to die than to live." And the Lord said, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Then Jonah went out of the city and sat down east of the city and made a booth for himself. And he sat under it in the shade, waiting to see what would become of the city. And the Lord appointed a bush. You know, this is one of those lines of scripture that can be used for political purposes every now and then. The Lord God appointed, only beware of what happens to it. The Lord God appointed a bush and made it come over Jonah to give shade over his head, to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was very happy about the bush. And when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the bush so that it withered. It's political allegory, yeah. When the sun rose, God prepared a sultry east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah. And again he said, "It's better for me to die than to live." And the Lord said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry because of the bush?" And he said, "Yes, angry enough to die." Then the Lord said, "You're concerned about the bush, for which you did not labor and which you did not grow. It came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left?" This isn't a raving compliment to the Assyrians. But the implication is, if they do bad things, they don't know any better. And he says, that many people who don't know their right hand from their left, and also many animals. One of the very few passages in Scripture that shows real concern for the animals. And I think the implication maybe is there isn't much difference between the people of Nineveh and the animals. But the question that it raises, you see, is, should people like the Ninevites or the Assyrians be forgiven? Most prophets, I think, would have said no. The prophets tend towards zeal. And the prophets can be very inspiring and uplifting. But think of Jeremiah, for example, and his prayer for the men of Anatoth, which was simply, "Let me see your vengeance on them." And that's what Jonah wanted to see with the Assyrians. That would be justice. Actually, the Hebrew word for vengeance is often thought or explained away as executing justice. And there's a sense in which it is. But now what the book of Jonah says is that they're God's creatures too. Shouldn't God also be concerned about them? What do you think? And what light does he shed on prophecy in the end? Andrew, and then yeah. 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 Gabe? To let people live, yes. And yes, David? Yes, I think part of the message of the book is that prophets shouldn't take themselves quite so seriously. That Jonah here is definitely a figure of fun. If you read that with any intelligence at all, it's a funny book and meant to be. And I think it's important that it's in there. I think it might have been more effective if they had put that at the end of the Book of the 12 to just tone it down a little bit. That a lot of the prophets are angry a lot of the time. And they had plenty to be angry about. But you see, you don't, anywhere in the Bible, you don't get like one book that gets it all right. You get a whole smorgasbord of different perspectives, and it's the balance. We'll meet in the wisdom literature in Koheleth. We'll read there is a time to kill, and a time to give life, a time to hate, and a time to love. And so how do you know which is right? Well, it's all in the timing. So it's not that one thing is right intrinsically, it's that things have to be appropriate to their time. Yes. That's what we call revelation in history. Yeah, yeah. Oh, they did. And I mean, to my mind, the prophets are really what make the Hebrew Bible worth reading. And there's no other body of literature anywhere that has the same kind of passion for justice. I think what you get from the Book of Jonah is that even that has its limitations sometime, and that one shouldn't then think we are totally righteous if we go along with this. That you also have to have some perspective on life. It doesn't invalidate anything that Amos or Jeremiah said, but it's saying, okay, but there's also a bigger picture. Yes.
In addition to sort of making fun of prophets, is it supposed to sort of make the people of Israel look bad too? That the Ninevites immediately listen and repent, and even the people on the boat immediately listen and praise God?
Yes, I think. But nearly everything in the prophetic corpus makes the people of Israel look bad. They're the prime target. But it's just humanity. Let me finish by summarizing for you another book that was unfortunately left out of the Bible. And that is the Testament of Abraham. Have any of you ever read it? You will find it in any collection of the pseudepigrapha. It is quasi-apocalyptic, but that's not the point that I'm citing it for. And the story goes like this. Abraham was a perfectly righteous man. And when the time came for Abraham to die, God wanted to go easy on him. So he sent the archangel Michael to coax him. And Abraham didn't want to go. So then he decided to give him a last wish. And he wanted a tour of the earth so that he could see everything that was going on. And so the angel took him up in a heavenly chariot, helicopter, and as he's going around, he saw a couple committing adultery. And he said, "O Lord, let the earth open and swallow them." And since Abraham was a perfectly righteous man, God could not refuse anything he asked. There they went. Then he saw thieves breaking in. And he said, "O Lord, let fire come down from heaven and demolish them." And again, gone. And a few more like that. And then God said to Michael, "Take him back." Take him back. Abraham is perfectly righteous and he has no compassion for sinners. I, on the other hand, made them all. I want them all to live. And so Abraham comes back, and eventually the death comes to him and in disguise and tricks him and takes him off. But that, again, it's exceptional in the corpus of ancient Jewish literature, I think, but a healthy exception of one that's suggesting that, yes, I mean, righteousness is good, but rein it in a little bit every now and then. We see this also in the book of Koheleth. Is the idea that too much of anything is bad. Everything, that there is a need for moderation too. Yes.
Just
Julian.
it also reminds me kind of the way that the pagans in Jonah react. Reminds me also of some of the saga stories in Genesis, where the outsiders or the foreigners are actually the morally upright.
Yeah. You know that story where the man is in the town for the night? And where he had gone, well, that's actually in Judges, where the man pushed on so that he could be in an Israelite city. And then when he gets there, the people of the town who are sons of Belial come and ask his host to bring him out so that we may know him. And you can read the story in Judges. But I think, there's a whole strand in the Bible that construes the people of Israel as the holy nation. Get this in the Wisdom of Solomon later on, where everything the Israelite people does is holy and good. But then you have another side that punches holes in that and says, humanity is humanity. And it's not going to be all that different, whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or whatever else you happen to be. Okay, them's the prophets. So on Monday, we'll talk about Ezra and Nehemiah. And by the way, there will be no class on Friday next week. I figure the day after the midterm exam, there's no point. Day after the midterm exam and right before spring break. But also, we have a meeting up in Boston that both I and the TAs will be at. So have a good weekend.